Hello everybody. I hope you enjoyed the first lecture. I got some really great feedback and it was really helpful for me to get a sense of how to design these classes better. So today we're going to go into the first real historical lecture. The lecture that you just listened to was a little bit more theoretical about historiography as opposed to history per se, and now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. My goal for today is to really go over two things. First of all, to give you kind of a lightning review of Jewish history from the beginnings of time all the way up until the beginnings of the first millennium, the year zero. And then we're going to go from there. We're going to look a little bit at Jewish sectarianism. I want to give you a sense of the diversity of Jewish thought at the beginning of the first millennium. So that's our goal for today, those two things. Let's get started. So here you see in the cover image a really interesting kind of thing. It's a mural from the Dura Europos synagogue, which is a 3rd century synagogue that was unearthed in rather remarkably good condition. And as you can see, it's a great example of Hellenistic Judaism. It's a great example looking at the influence of Hellenism on Jewish thought and practice. This is a scene in the synagogue that depicts the rescue of Moses from the Nile River by Bat Paro, the daughter of Pharaoh. You can see her there at the bottom of the screen, tastefully edited by my little block there. But in the background, so obviously they had no problem with nudity and things like this in the walls of synagogues. But if you look at the style of representation, they all essentially look like Middle Eastern, really Greek women with the almond-shaped eyes and things like that. And the sort of two-dimensional framing, the expressions, all this sort of stylistic devices are clear influence of Greek culture, which is normal. I mean, after all, the Jews were living in a very Greek culture at the time. And that's going to be the underlying theme of today's class. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about our sources for Jewish history. I mean, what exactly are our sources for Jewish history? First of all, we have the Bible, the Torah, perhaps better phrase, the Tanakh, which refers to the 3 sections of the Hebrew Scriptures. That is the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, followed by the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and then finally by the Ketuvim, or writings, which cover things like Proverbs and Psalms and things like that. And it's a fantastic source with all kinds of amazing information, and it really is the first go-to source for any of the information we're going to look at in the ancient period. Unfortunately, it is not intended by its authors as a historical source. I mean, the prophets and so on, when they recorded those things, they were not necessarily intending to give us a modern, critical historical account of what happened in the ancient period. The primary goal of the works of Nach in particular are spiritual edification, to teach us spiritual lessons and to try to, advance the cause of Jewish values and so on. So it's great for gathering information, but it should not be considered a history book per se. Secondly, we have the so-called pseudographa and apocrypha. These are works which are ancient, usually of Jewish authorship, but they didn't make it into the Tanakh. For various reasons, sometimes discussed in the Talmud, for example, these books were debated. Do they have sufficient spiritual content? Are they in line with mainstream thinking on Judaism? In fact, some books like Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, were actually debated and made it into the Tanakh. Others were debated and did not make it into the Tanakh. For example, Ben Sira. And these books are sometimes included in other Bibles. Like, for example, the Catholic Bible has some really interesting books that the Jewish Bible does not include. And I'm not talking here about the so-called New Testament, which is the Christian scriptures per se. There are books like Judith and Tobit and 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which were considered Sifrei Chitzoniyim, external books or exterior books by the Jews. They were considered, integral to other traditions, and they were in fact incorporated into non-Jewish Bibles. But these kinds of texts, like the biblical texts, were intended primarily to, impart an edifying message, cannot be considered appropriately as historical sources, but they do have historical data that we can use. Finally, we have scattered sources in various non-Jewish documents and archaeological finds and things like that. And these are of somewhat dubious value as well. First of all, there are not so many of them. There's clearly the first source to go to are intrinsic Jewish sources, but there are occasional references in ancient Egyptian literature, later Greek literature, and Roman literature, which can shed valuable light on Jewish history. Obviously, they're highly tendentious, often trying to cast the Jews in a particular light. This is the stele of the pharaoh Merneptah, the earliest reference found to Jews in a non-Jewish source, and it dates from the 13th century before the Common Era. And there's this phrase, "Israel is wasted, its seed exists no more." Rather nasty kind of doomsday statement. But if we look over here, okay, so this is what Israel's seed looks like today. Okay, interesting, nice, happy children. It's a Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day celebration there. And this is what the author, or this is what the pharaoh Merneptah looks like. Not so good. Let's have a look at it again. Here's Israel's seed, which according to the pharaoh is wasted and no more. And let's look at the pharaoh. I mean, I'm just saying. Okay, let's go on. So, anyways, let's go quickly through the First Temple period, and this is going to be a lightning flash through quite a few centuries of history. We begin with the conquest of Canaan, which is described in the last section of the Torah and the first few books of Nach, specifically Joshua and then Judges, and then we move from there rather rapidly into the monarchy. The establishment of the first Jewish king, known as King Saul, which then is handed over to his son-in-law, King David. In fact, that takes up most of the description of the book of Samuel. And then it's handed over to David's son, Solomon, Shlomo, and that goes into the book of Kings and so on. After the monarchy is established, then we have its dissolution into two states, two divided kingdoms, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. I'm going to show you a map of that shortly. Then in the late 8th century, a terrible tragedy strikes as the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians, and the 10 northern tribes are taken away into captivity and lost forever. This is the source of the famous 10 lost tribes of Judaism. And it's interesting, if you follow the history of the idea of the 10 lost tribes, there are all kinds of peoples, including, for example, the British people, American Indians, African tribes who have claimed to be descended from the 10 lost tribes. Might be some interesting things actually coming out of DNA research right now. But moving on from there, the most important event afterwards is the 6th century destruction of all of Israel by the Babylonians, and then the carting away of a good chunk of the population to Babylon in particular. They are there for about 70 years before they are allowed to return and rebuild the temple. Most Jews stayed in Babylon, but quite a few returned to Israel and created a second temple. And there was a Jewish Renaissance. So if you have a look at the maps here, here's a map of the divided kingdoms of Judah and Israel. You can see that Judah is in the Judean desert and southward towards the Negev. The kingdom of Israel is further north in the region of today's Shomron, the Galil, and even extended across the Jordan River into contemporary Jordan. Here's a map of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the period in which the Jews were carted off there. And they're leaving from places like Judah, you see towards the left, moving over into the Mesopotamian region. The word Mesopotamia means between the rivers, and it refers to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, not shown here, but they sort of go diagonally down from the center of the map into the Persian Gulf, what would be today contemporary Iraq, ending in Kuwait. And the Jews set up several cities or several villages, which later grow into cities along these two rivers, and this becomes the heartland of Judaism for the next few hundred years, as we shall discuss in later lectures. This is kind of an interesting little thing. This is a piece of pottery that was discovered in Israel around this time of the Renaissance of Jews after the return under Ezra in the 6th century. And it's written in the Old Hebrew script, and the text reads, "Belonging to Yehoyishma, daughter of Shamash Shar Usur, So the Yehoyishma is a Jewish name, meaning God will listen in Hebrew. And Shama Shar Usur is a man's name that refers explicitly to a Babylonian god. So it's kind of an interesting document because it shows that the daughter who owned this signet had a Hebrew name that with a clear reference to the Jewish God, but her father, who was not so frum, had a Babylonian name. And I think this is a little bit like if you could imagine like a, I don't know, a t-shirt or something, and you looked at the collar in the back and it said, this belongs to Yehudis, the daughter of Marvin, as kind of a comparison today, where a girl has a Hebrew name and her father has an English name. I myself, I go by my slave name, Henry, in public, I guess. But all of my kids have Hebrew names. So it's kind of a funny thing. And if you go back a couple generations in my family, then everyone has Hebrew names again. So there's kind of this cycle of Hebrew and then more assimilationist, then Hebrew and so on. But let's move on. Okay. So, concluding with the first part of this lecture, the next big chapter is the introduction of Greek culture, known as Hellenism. Hellas is the Greek word for Greece, and it really starts with Alexander the Great. If you have a look at this map here, Alexander comes from Macedon, which is towards the top left of the map, and he embarks on this massive crusade in the 4th century before the Common Era that conquers the entire eastern half of the Mediterranean basin and then extends out through Mesopotamia and makes its way all the way over to Afghanistan and what would be today parts of Pakistan. And this area is suddenly included within one overarching culture, Greek culture, and this creates essentially a Hellenism that stretches over many boundaries that prior to this point had never experienced a significant contact with Greek culture. And it really makes a huge difference. In fact, the Jews loved it. The Jews just found Hellenism so fascinating. One may say that Western culture, meaning European culture and by extension American, North American culture, South American culture as well, really derives from the cultures that come from two cities. Athens, which is one of the most important Greek cities, and Jerusalem, of course. And this refers to the melding of Hellenistic culture or Greek culture with Jewish culture. The Greeks contributed philosophy, art, literature, science, a lot of the ways that we think about the world, the way that we understand beauty, for example, really are based on Greek norms. But on the other hand, the Jews contributed a lot of our religious knowledge, a lot of our morality came from the concept of Jewish monotheism, the idea of a personal deity, meaning a God that actually knows each of us personally and will communicate with us individually and that we can communicate with individually through prayer, a God that worships a God that values justice and will punish the wicked and reward the one who does right and so on. And of course the extensive idea of life after death, which really flows from the idea of schar va'onesh, or punishment and reward. But the difficulty is, and was especially for Hellenistic Jews, where to draw the line. I mean, it's all fine and good to have Greek science, Greek literature, Greek art, things like that. But when you get to Greek mythology, Greek gods, things like that, where do you say stop here and no more culture, because then it affects our own culture? So in fact, this is one of the major fights that was battled by the Jews in the second and first centuries, particularly in the Hashmonaim revolt of the 2nd century, where, as I'm sure you're familiar from your Hanukkah stories, that several Jews began to protest against other Jews who were so-called mityavnim, or self-Greekers, those who make themselves Greek, and they felt that they were tossing away too much that was essential to Jewish tradition in open slavish emulation of Greek norms, which got to the point of even desecrating the temple with idols and things like that. A national revolt ensued, led by the Maccabees, and surprisingly, the Jews were victorious, and they succeeded in establishing a Jewish kingdom for a brief period of time, separating from Alexander's reign and creating an independent state. Now, By the time we get to the year 0, the Hashmonaim had unfortunately declined, and ultimately the Romans began to take over the region. By the year 0, the Romans were firmly in power, and now we're moving into the second part of today's lecture, which really has to do with Jewish sectarianism. I'd like to take kind of a quick cross-section at Jewish opinion about how to deal with the Roman reality, and we'll place that into the larger historical context. So, the first group that we should look are the so-called Sadducees, or in Hebrew the Tzedukim, who took their name from Tzadok, who was one of the early Kohanim. So-called because they were associated quite profoundly with the temple and its rituals. The Romans, having taken over political power, essentially gave the temple to those people who would bow to their wishes. And as a result, the Sadducees gained power in exchange for ultimately capitulation to the Roman demands. The Romans would demand things which went far beyond really what was acceptable under traditional Jewish practice, but the Sadducees felt that the Romans were, invincible, and the only way to really preserve Jewish practice would be to simply go along with what they were thinking. Similarly, the Sadducees were highly Hellenized. They rejected core elements of what had become Jewish standard thought, for example, the belief in the oral Torah, life after death, things like that. And they were excoriated by other groups of Jews, as we shall see. Here's a piece of art from another religious tradition, and there's a Sadducee here known as Caiaphas, and you can see that he's portrayed even by another religious tradition, not necessarily in a complimentary light. So the first group are the Sadducees. Then we move on to the Pharisees, and these are the so-called good guys. The term Pharisee in English derives from the Hebrew perushim, which means to separate, those who separate, lifrosh, and their strategy was to essentially separate from the political institutions of Jewish power. They believed in kind of a tactical retreat, meaning if they could not control the temple without giving in to Roman demands, it would be better if they retreated from the temple, if they abandoned the temple, but they retreated to a position where they could safely define the core elements of Judaism and ensure that their followers were towing the line. Things like tithes became very important, attachment to scholars, study of the oral Torah, these things became prominent to the Perushim. They are essentially the main progenitors of what we would call today Rabbinic Judaism. The Pharisees were the rabbis, and most of the heroes that we have in the Jewish tradition derive from this group. The next group that's really important are the Zealots, and we're going to spend a lot more time talking about them next week when we look at the Roman-Jewish wars. But their strategy was one of attack, meaning they did not believe at all in capitulating to the Romans like the Sadducees. They also did not believe in a tactical retreat like the Pharisees. They believed that the only way to defend the Jewish polity would be to forcibly throw the Romans out of the country. An amazingly quixotic and fanciful kind of desire given the overwhelming power of the Romans, but emboldened by the example of the Hashmonim, the Hasmoneans, the Zealots felt that this was a viable alternative, and thus they were prepared to undertake it, even to the extent of fighting with other Jewish groups. We'll return to those groups, we'll return to the Zealots next week. Finally, you have the Essenes, which were one of several highly separatist Jewish groups whose strategy was radical retreat, meaning the end of time was near, the Messiah was about to arrive, by the way, a belief that cascaded through all of these Jewish groups in one way or another, and that the correct way to deal with the Roman threat was to totally distance themselves from everything and focus completely on spiritual activities. Many of the Essenes practiced rather bizarre antinomian behavior, not necessarily traditional in Jewish practice at all. They tended to live in caves like these in the Judean desert, where in 1952, a young Arab boy was looking for a lost sheep. He wandered into one of these caves and he found one of the most amazing treasure troves discovered in modern history, the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls. Called the Dead Sea because Qumran, where they were found, is very close to the Dead Sea. And if we look at those scrolls, like we go into one of these caves here, watch this really cool effect. Here we go into the caves. He found these clay pots and he opened them up and he brought them into Jerusalem, and they were found to have all these amazing scrolls, samples of the entire Hebrew Bible, and lots of other documents as well, which were collected by groups like the Essenes and sheltered away in these caves. So we know a lot about the tenor of Jewish life at the turn of the year zero through documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are now housed, by the way, in an architecturally amazing shrine in Israel, in Jerusalem, called the Shrine of the Book. You walk into this amazingly shaped device, which is supposed to be evocative of the original containers in which they were discovered, and you find the various scrolls laid out for public viewing. So, those are the major groups. Let's plot them on a Venn diagram very quickly so it's easy to remember. First of all, you have the Sadducees, whose goal was to capitulate. They said the only way that we can manage our relationship with the Romans is if we give in to them, and we essentially let them have what they want. They were opposed by the Zealots, who felt that we should be at war with the Romans. We should forcibly evict them from the land of Israel. And also at odds with the Essenes, who felt that, politics, nicht für uns, not for us. We're going to go live in caves and separate completely from society. The sweet spot, which really evoked elements of all of these groups in one form or another, were the Pharisees, whose primary strategy was one of tactical retreat, meaning a temporary and well-defined retreat in order to be able to maintain a much more defensible ideological boundary with the outside society. And those are the progenitors of Rabbinic Judaism today. Okay, so that's the second lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to speaking with you in person, virtually, and in the next lecture.